Bienvenue, bienvenido, herzlich willkommen, welcome. A handful of greetings in Romance and Germanic languages, and yet today we want to talk about the Celtic languages. Felly croeso cynnes I chi gyd. That branch right on the western edge of the vast Indo-European family tree. My name is Mererid Hopwood, and to answer our question, so what are the Celtic languages? I'm delighted to have with me in this temple of Zoom, this Zoominar, three colleagues from the Department of Welsh and Celtic Studies at Aberystwyth University, Wales. Dr. Pader O'Myrchety, Dr. Simon Rodway, and poet, academic and author Eirig Salisbury. Pader, whose specialism lies in the Gaelic languages and literature, and who is currently working on a research project that has taken him to Denmark. He's on loan there, so to speak. Simon Rodway, whose specialism lies in Middle Welsh, medieval Welsh manuscripts, Old and Middle Irish and Celtic philology, and Eirig Salisbury, who can bring both medieval and modern literature together in innovative and unexpected ways like nobody else in the world. The plan is then to give an introduction to the field, and then we will hang around to answer any questions you might have. And if we can't deal with them all in the given slot, then of course, you're more than welcome to come to Aberystwyth to study what we believe to be the most fascinating of subjects in the most beautiful of places, and all the other universities in Wales too come to that. But for now, let's see what can we tackle in roughly 20 minutes. Pader, I introduced you as a specialist in the Gaelic languages. You speak Irish, Manx, and some others, but that suggests that the Celtic languages then is more than that.
So yes, as you say, Mererid, I'm an Irish person, but was educated in Scotland and live in Wales, so speak Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, and a bit of Manx as well. And they all form one part of a branch of the Celtic languages, although they form two separate shoot-offs. We talk about the Gaelic languages, Irish, Scottish and Manx, as one branch, Goidelic or Gaelic, and we talk about them as sister languages. Their cousins, if you like, form another branch of Celtic, the Brittonic languages, and they include Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, which is now spoken in the northwest of France. And these two branches of Celtic join further down the line the Indo-European branch of languages, which includes the languages spoken all over Europe. Germanic, Slavic, and beyond Europe as well, all the way back to a common root which is shared with languages such as Sanskrit, Urdu, and even further back than that. Whoa. So yeah, so when we talk about the Celtic languages, we're talking about something that is grafted, if you like, onto the history of Europe and Asia, and by extension to the New World.
Of course, yes, because they've travelled as people have travelled. I'm hearing now there's sounds of the Doctor Who TARDIS ringing in my ears, and I wonder, Simon, if you can take us back in time, as far back as we can, then, in terms of texts and any kind of evidence we have of how this can be claimed to be one family. Simon.
Yes, thank you, Mererid. Yes, today, as Pader was saying, Celtic languages are confined to a few western regions of France, Britain, and Ireland, and to small communities in parts of the Americas. But in the ancient period, they were widespread across Europe, as we can see primarily from the evidence of place, personal, and ethnic names recorded in classical sources, and the relatively small number of inscriptions. The earliest of the latter come from a small area in the Alps, centred around the town of Lugano on the border between Switzerland and Italy. Some of these can be dated to the 6th or perhaps even the 7th century BC. Modern scholars have named the language of these inscriptions Lepontic, after the local ethnic group, the Leponti. Much better attested is the closely related Gaulish, which was spoken in France and Belgium and then carried east by historically documented migrations from the 4th century BC onwards, which brought Celtic speakers as far as the area around Ankara in Turkey. These were the Galatians who were addressed by St. Paul. A rather different Celtic language is attested by a number of inscriptions from the northeastern interior of Spain, the territory of the Celtiberi, the Celts of Iberia. The further one travels from the Mediterranean, the sparser and later the evidence, as literacy travelled slowly into Northern Europe, and classical authors had little interest or knowledge of this area before the expansion of the Roman Empire into Gaul in the 1st century BC. Our first secure evidence for Celtic speech in Britain dates from the 1st century BC, and for Ireland we have to wait until the 2nd century AD and Ptolemy's geography. Of course, Celtic speakers may have arrived in these islands many hundreds of years previously. We simply do not know. By about 400 AD, the Irish had developed their Ogham alphabet based on a classical cipher system, and we have hundreds of inscriptions in primitive Irish, mostly on gravestones or boundary markers dating from the period of about 400 to 600 AD. Clustering in the southern counties of Ireland and also in parts of Wales and Cornwall settled by Irish speakers in the Dark Ages. They mostly record only personal names, so as literature they're hugely disappointing. The earliest surviving examples of Irish on parchment using the Roman alphabet date from the late 7th century, mostly glosses or short texts preserved in Latin manuscripts. By about 800 AD, we have records of Old Welsh and Old Breton, the latter being the language of British emigrants to the old province of Armorica in northwest Gaul in the post-Roman period. In the 10th century, we have Old Cornish comes to light for the first time. Again, only glosses and fragments in Latin manuscripts. However, this may not be the full picture. We know the manuscripts have been lost on a large scale from both Britain and Ireland, and it's quite possible that some works of literature preserved in manuscripts dating from the 12th century onwards in Ireland and the 13th in Wales were copied from now lost manuscripts contemporary with or even earlier than the earliest extant examples of Old Irish, Old Welsh, and so on.
Could just go back a bit, Paddy. Could you just say then, perhaps give us some modern day examples of the level of similarity we're talking about here between the languages?
Yes, so there are examples of, if we take individual words, there are examples where we can see very clearly where, for instance, a change in the sound has occurred in one branch but hasn't changed in the other. So if we take two words like mawr in Welsh, meaning big or large, that corresponds to more in Irish, which has the same meaning, and they're almost instantly recognizable. So there's no, obviously sound changes are involved because they're not the same sound, but they're on the surface very clear to either speakers of Irish or Welsh. If we take another very common word, like the word man in Irish is far. In Welsh, the word is gŵr. And on the surface, these look like they're two completely different words, but of course they're not. We know that they're both the inherited word for man. Irish and Scottish Gaelic, in both Irish and Scottish Gaelic, we have far in Irish or fed in Scottish Gaelic, so that you can see that Irish and Scottish Gaelic are much closer to one another than either is to Welsh. So that's just one example.
And I think I'm right to say that a similar comparison is between the k and the p sound. So you have the mac, meaning son, MacDonald, which is worldwide well known, and then, but in Welsh, mac is map. Is that also a fixed kind of similarity?
That's an excellent example, even a better example than the one that popped into my head. And that's often the basis on which people sometimes talk about P and Q Celtic. that there are certain, there's a certain branch of Celtic which in which you have that c sound. So mock in Irish, meaning son, as you said, and it's very common in surnames. It's found in New Life in terms of the provision of fast food in McDonald's, but that is a Gaelic surname, as against mab in Welsh. The other example would be, say, an initial position at the start of a word. The Irish word for head is ceann, corresponding to pen in Welsh.
We're now going to ask Eirig to pick up where Simon left off and where we've got proper words on vellum, if not on paper, and the evidence is there. Tell us a bit about that, and perhaps in particular the poetic tradition. Eirig.
Okay, Meredith. As Simon Rodway mentioned, manuscripts of Welsh language literature have survived from the middle of the 13th century onwards. Now, 6 very important collections were written before about 1400, some of which bear colourful titles, quite literally, like Llyfr Gwyn Rhydderch, the White Book of Rhydderch, and Llyfr Coch Hergest, the Red Book of Hergest. Now, all these early manuscripts contain a dazzling variety of texts, mainly poetry, but also prose. Now, this is where you can find the 4 branches of the Mabinogi, the earliest prose stories of Britain. Now, these stories about mystical hills and castles, monsters from the other world, shape changes and wondrous cauldrons are among the greatest treasures of Welsh literature. Now, the manuscripts have also safeguarded other native prose tales, as well as Arthurian romances, translations, religious and vaticinary texts, and much more. But what unites all these manuscripts is poetry. From the earliest times, the poet played a central role in Welsh language culture. Now, it's important to emphasize that being a poet was a profession. Poets were employed for their ability to compose poems of praise for their patrons. Now, they were also feared for their ability to satirize. In a society with a strong oral tradition, the poet's power to influence was unmatched. 2 early manuscripts were named actually after poets, Llyfr Aneirin and Llyfr Taliesin, 2 poets who apparently lived in the 6th century. Now, the power of the poets to a large degree went hand in hand with the power of their patrons, which is why the grandeur of professional poetry reached its high point during the ages of the Welsh princes, when a poet's place in the princely court was guaranteed by law. So when Prince Llywelyn ap Gruffydd was killed in 1282, Wales was conquered by Edward I, and almost overnight, the poets lost the patronage of the highest rung in society. Now, whereas the poets of the princes in earlier time excelled at composing extremely intricate poems that showcased their extraordinary ability to manipulate words, meter, and syntax, later poets cultivated a more straightforward style, while at the same time displaying the same mastery of their craft. Now, this was due mainly to the fact that they adopted a new meter, the cywydd, composed of a series of rhyming couplets and in full cynghanedd. But what's cynghanedd, I hear you shout? Well, we've come to one of the most exciting developments in the history of Welsh poetry, one whose roots are found in the earliest poetry of Aneirin and Taliesin and can be seen formulating in the work of the poets who sang for the princes. But it's in the 14th century that cynghanedd comes into its own. But again, you shout, what is it? Well, it is essentially a poetry sound system, a method that governs the way a line of poetry is put together, based on internal rhyming and complex repetition of consonants.
So, Eirig, I think we need an example now of this magical poetry that you're talking about. How about something like, Welerith fel y merhod o'n cwmpas, campwaith dewin hynod, hen linell bell nad yw'n bod, hen derfyn nad yw'n darfod. Will that do?
That will do. It's very nice. Hopefully, people can hear, hopefully you can hear that music in the words. I won't go into more details, but it is worth mentioning that Cynghanedd is unique to the Welsh language, and that the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics calls it the most sophisticated system of sound patterning practiced in any poetry in the world. So this sound system was championed by the yw'r, the most celebrated of whom was Dafydd ap Gwilym, local boy here in the hills around Aberystwyth, who wrote praise and love poetry to a very high standard. Now, Dafydd probably played an instrumental part in grounding the cywydd as a metre suitable for professional poetry and formalising the use of Cynghanedd in it. Now, he helped set the stage for a host of brilliant poets in what has become known as a golden age of Welsh poetry in the 15th century. Two important things did survive into the modern period. The first was the lingering influence of the system itself. Poetry continued to fulfill an important social role in Wales, and a poet's service would be occasionally paid for. Now, this is still true today. The second is Cynghanedd itself. The same essential system that was formed in the Middle Ages is still used by Welsh poets today, me included, and of course yourself, Mererid, and remains, I think, Welsh poetry's most potent legacy.
Brilliant. Well, diolch yn fawr iawn. Yeah, this is a very important thing, isn't it, for us to share, is that while the language is ancient, the Celtic languages are ancient, and indeed the traditions that we partake in, but they are still alive. And this poetic one, I think it's worth saying, and we do smile, chuckle even, but yet we take it very, very seriously, that we're delighted in Wales that we honour poets to this day with such grand gifts and prizes as chairs that are in effect thrones, vast, enormous pieces of furniture, and real gold and silver crowns. And we don't just give them to the poets, we have ceremonies. So the Druids gather in circles of stone and they announce where the festival is going to take place, and it takes place the following year in a field, and thousands gather, and the Druids again cluster onto the stage, and the chief Druid, the archdruid, calls out the poet whose poem has been submitted in pseudonym nobody knows, if indeed anybody will win, because sometimes no poems are good enough. But if indeed on this occasion there is a winner, the poet must stand, is taken to the chair on centre stage where an enormous sword is raised. And this is quite a scary spectacle. But we need to hurry on to say that this sword, the blade, never sees the light of day, because this is the sword of peace. The cry goes out, is there peace? Oes heddwch, and it is to the accompaniment of this beautiful word, heddwch, that the poet may sit in his or her chair. And it is really a wonderful thing. We're also delighted to say that, of course, in our own national anthem, in Wales at least, the first line describes Wales as the land of poetry and music. But there is more to it than that. And it hasn't been an easy ride all the way. Yes, we still speak Welsh, and yes, the other languages, the other Celtic languages are still spoken. But if you just think about in 1891, in the census there, 54% of the Welsh population spoke Welsh. And by today, it's lingering, it's hanging on to the 20%. There has been a dramatic decrease. There have been reasons. We had acts and laws, Henry VIII, famous Acts of Union, which decreed against the Welsh language. We've had one disastrous event after the other, but still Welsh is spoken. Padr, can I bring you in here now to tell us, what is it like? What is the situation? Why are we here huddled so crazy about these languages? Who speaks them? What is the state of health of the Celtic languages, and why are they so important?
So yeah, as you've just heard from Eric Welsh has a wonderful and a wonderfully long literary tradition, and of the Celtic languages spoken today, each has a rich literature and unique culture, which, in spite of centuries of marginalisation and quite often outward official hostility, endures. And it's that endurance which connects speakers of Celtic language today, rather than any sense of a common inherited Celtic culture. So in the Republic of Ireland, where I'm from, the Irish language enjoys official recognition, which has sometimes failed to translate into official concern for Irish-speaking communities. But nonetheless, Irish holds a prominent place in the education system and is now, in very recent years, an official language of the European Union, something which has both created jobs for Irish speakers and improved access to services for Irish speakers. And Irish, like Welsh, continues to produce a wealth of brilliant literature. And recent years have seen increased interest in Irish literature, including the translation of the great Irish language novel Craig na Cille, or Churchyard Clay, into a number of European languages, including German. Scottish Gaelic, the Gaelic language of Scotland, enjoys less official status than Irish or Wales, but it attracts huge interest from those interested in Scottish history, Scottish culture, and Scottish literature. And one very illustrative example of that is the fact that last year, the app, which everybody will be familiar with, Duolingo, launched a Scottish Gaelic course, and it managed to attract over 500,000 learners in its first year of existence, which is not bad for a language spoken by just under 60,000 people. It shows the level of interest and the level of attraction that these languages hold for people across the world. Manx, the language of the Isle of Man, which ceased to be spoken actually as a community language in the 20th century, has since undergone a remarkable revival, including the establishment now in the Isle of Man of a Manx medium primary school, where children not only learn Manx, but learn through the medium of Manx the entire primary curriculum, and is held up around the world as an example of the way in which languages can be brought back from the brink, which of course is an increasingly and unfortunately important topic of concern, as minority languages, not just in Britain and in Ireland, but across the entire world, are being really pushed to the brink by forces far beyond the control of their speakers. Welsh is, relatively speaking, it's the Celtic language which has the greatest degree of institutional support, and that is reflected in its number of speakers. As you said, just over 20% of people in Wales can speak Welsh. But the language also, as we've already heard, supports a very lively literary life, much of which revolves around the annual literary festival that both yourself and Derek have talked about, the Eisteddfod. Breton is slightly different for socio-political reasons, because it is the only Celtic language now spoken on continental Europe. It's at risk not from the encroachment of English, but rather from the encroachment of French. And Breton has 500,000 speakers, the largest number of speakers of any Celtic language, but social factors and official state hostility to the language in the past, and also to certain degrees in the present, mean that these speakers are largely older speakers, and the language has not managed, the language community has not managed to regenerate itself within the community in the way that we would expect. In recent years, however, an increased awareness of the importance of the language has led to the establishment of Breton medium schools with the aim of creating new speakers. And that's the challenge that remains for all of the Celtic languages, that challenge of preserving the traditional communities in which these languages have been spoken for centuries, while attracting and cultivating new speakers in those traditional communities, and also in urban centres, as processes, as I say, social and demographic processes, which are beyond the control of any one individual or any, to a certain degree, beyond the control even of any one state government, force language communities to deal with these circumstances.
And Cornish, there's a revival there too, to a certain extent.
There is, yes. Cornish is, the gap, if you like, is much larger with Cornish. So Cornish in the southwest of the island of Britain ceased to be spoken as a community language in the 18th century, but has since undergone a revival, which has very much focused on literature and culture, and has modelled itself or looked to inspiration quite often to Wales, and has managed to cultivate a number of speakers. Again, another example of a language being not just back from the brink, but almost being dragged up from below the cliff edge.
Well, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi gyd. Thank you so much for that. We know it's important, not just because we're passionate about these languages, but because diversity is important. We've learned that from so many walks of life. The danger, the impoverishment that comes with the uniform. These languages bring so much more than just more sets of labels for the same sets of things. After all, when we look through our Celtic windows on the world, we do see it differently. The good example that I like to share is the one that shows how in Welsh we can't say I have anything. Things are just with us. Being biased, I think that's a very enlightened view of possession. And also I know that in Irish, as in Welsh, we actually hear smells. And we can't be afraid in Welsh, only fear is upon us. Not that we want to end on that fearful note, but we would like to invite you to hang on to ask questions. You've heard a little bit there already about the Mabinogi tales in the days when we could walk to Ireland from Wales, and in the days when birds spoke as well as sang. There are so many things there. The text that Simon has touched upon, I'm sure there are many questions there, and the diversity of the Celtic family, Pedr would be willing to answer, and then the poetry, of which Eirig is a living example, a carry-on from those David ap Gwilym days. So do stay with us. But for now, we'll say goodbye.
Well,
Pedr?
Martian live.
A Simon?
Swan.
Hwyl fawr. Diolch I chi am wrando.